I'm here with Alejandro Salas from Transparency International. Do you think that we can get rid of corruption?
Well, definitely we can. It's a tough thing to do because corruption is embedded in all societies around the world. There are no countries that are free of the problem. And it's a phenomenon that touches at many levels. No? It's at the individual level. It's the greed, it's the desire of people of getting richer, of accumulating more power. But it's also something that is in the organizations, in the institutions, in the political system. So it's a very complex problem, but definitely we have to keep ourselves positive and believe that there's something we can do against it.
What role do you think Norway can play in the international anti-corruption movement?
Well, I think Norway plays a very, very important role because in a way it's one of the countries that is perceived and believed to be amongst the cleanest countries when it comes to corruption. We barely hear in the news scandals or problems related to corruption, and I think that the authority coming from a country like this one is very important. We have seen it in the past. For example, I have worked a lot for example, in Central America, where Norway has always played a very important role in terms of promoting human rights, the idea of the ombudsman to protect citizens, and it has a very specific weight. I think that Norway can also, and in a way is already doing a lot to show that there are different ways of doing things.
But do you still think there is corruption in Norway, or are we completely clean of it?
Well, unfortunately, no country is free of corruption. No? Of course, in a setting like this one, you have a working democracy. There's a lot of checks and balances and controls, which is one of the main elements to prevent corruption from happening. But Norway shouldn't just cross the arms and say, well, we are completely free of the problem, because it can always emerge, no? Especially, I mean, in those situations where there's a lot of money involved, when there's a possibility of doing business, there will always be a temptation. So the risks, for example, when it comes to procurement, when the public sector wants to provide a service or construct a big infrastructure work, for example, there's always a risk, no? Also in politics, there are always risks. So one has to be very aware. And I think Norway, although you are doing very well, one has to be careful. No? And one has always to keep an eye open for these things.
I'm here with John Christensen, Director of Tax Justice Network. Do you think that we can get rid of corruption internationally?
Look, you can't necessarily get rid of it entirely, but there's a lot you can do to curtail it, in other words, to reduce it. In my opinion, corruption is often created by the opportunities. If the system isn't right, it creates opportunities for corruption. And we have globalized the world's markets and opened up the opportunities for corruption because of gaps in national law, weak international cooperation, possibilities for money to move across borders far too easily. And globalization can be very radically strengthened and corruption reduced if we simply moved towards enhanced international cooperation, more transparency across the market, and improved information exchange, and improved cooperation between judicial authorities. So there's a lot we could do. Unfortunately, this requires a degree of international cooperation, which is weak, and that boils down to a lack of political will.
And what do you think of Norway's role in the international anti-corruption movement? What role do we play, and do you think that we are a part of any corruption internationally?
Well, first of all, a bit of a conflict of interest because NORAD funds the organisation I represent, but I think Norway has for many years actually been prepared to take on some of the most difficult issues affecting international development. And I think any development economist, and I am a development economist, recognises that corruption is one of the biggest issues facing development, not just in the south, but also in the north. It is shaping the maldevelopment, the weak development in countries in Europe as much as elsewhere. So I think Norway has taken a very leading role. But of course that doesn't mean that Norway is free from corruption. For example, tax evasion is quite a serious problem, not as serious as other countries, but nonetheless it exists. We cannot possibly claim that Norway is 100% corruption-free, but it's better than most.
I'm here with Helen Garlick. Do you think that we can get rid of corruption?
Well, you know, when I was prosecuting the British aerospace case, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia once said, you know, corruption, you'll never get rid of it because it's human nature. And I think the response to that is, well, you know, it's also human nature to assault people, to be greedy, to be unfaithful, to be dishonest. But it's the mark of a civilized country that we do our level best to try and punish and deter this sort of crime. So we may never get rid of it, but every civilized society has to do its level best to do what it can to stamp it out.
What do you think of Norway's role in the international anti-corruption movement?
Well, the reason why I'm here today is because of the great admiration I have for the Norwegian government through NORAD. In my experience, Norwegians do something which very few other countries do, which is not only to support international aid generously and vigorously, but also to do their level best to tie it in with real and committed anti-corruption policies in the countries that they give money to. And I'm also here because of the Corruption Hunters Network that's sponsored by NORAD. And you know, it's my view that no other country in the world would be as enlightened and as generous as the Norwegian government in funding this group that just supports corruption prosecutors from all over the world.
Here in Trondheim we have the University for Science and Technology, and many of the engineers who graduate from the university will work in international companies such as Statoil. What do you think that they are not nearly taught anything about corruption during the 5 years of their masters?
Well, they should be, because if you're in international engineering, you're working in developing countries and emerging countries where you're really going to come up against it every day, whether it's small facilitation payments that you need in order to get your telephone installed or your water turned on in your apartment, or whether it's something really big, a terrible problem that confronts you when you're trying to do business. And to be ill-equipped for that seems to me to be not to be equipping your students properly. That there is a real place perhaps for, even if it's only a small part of the curriculum, to teaching young engineers about the dangers that they're going to face and what the rules are.